harvest festivals would look very different if they were to really represent the extent and nature of today's massive food industry. We spend nearly £30 billion on our food every year, and no less than 80% of what we buy is manufactured food. Increasingly, nutritionists are voicing doubts about the effects that eating refined and processed food may be having on our health. Dr. Kenneth Heaton explains why.
Well, as far as the energy side is concerned, they make energy so extraordinarily easy to get. You see, in nature, all energy foods have to be worked for. They may have to be hunted, they've got to be gathered, and when they've been put into the mouth, they've got to be chewed. And then the digestive system has quite a lot of work to do on the food to actually break it down and assimilate it. Whereas with foods as commonly eaten today, all this work has been done for us. All we have to do is open a can or a packet and put it straight into our mouths, and there is no work involved. Once they get into our stomachs, they don't fill it up as much as a natural bulky food like fruit would, and it all happens too easily and too quickly. And the end result is that we take in more energy than we need. You've really got to just look at the food and ask yourself, could you pick this off a tree or dig it out of the ground, or otherwise just obtain it in its natural state? And clearly, if you look at it like that, then canned peas or frozen beans are perfectly all right. It's just that they've been preserved. But if they've been put through various mechanical processes and had chemical things done to them, then the chances are they are very altered from their natural state and are probably depleted of certain good things and possibly enriched with certain bad things.
And certainly when you look at the highly mechanized technology that goes into the preparation of much of our food to make it tasty, attractive, cheap or convenient, it's clear that at the top of the list of priorities is the commercial need for relentless efficiency. Nutritional values would appear to figure rather a long way down that list. And yet it was precisely to preserve those values that food technologies originally evolved.
There's nothing at all new about processed foods. Take those pickled cucumbers, a glass jar. You might think to yourself, well, that must be modern technology at work, but that's not true. We've been preserving foods and treating them by primitive, time-tested technology for thousands of years. The purpose of them is to make sure that foodstuffs keep wholesome, even when they're out of season, to prevent them from going bad and making us ill, and also to keep them so that they could be transported over long distances. And the principle behind it was simply to make the food unavailable to microbes who might want to eat it just as much as we might, and might do it first. And so vegetables can be steeped in acetic acid, in the form we know as vinegar. Meat, particularly pork, may be soaked in brine. Fruits are boiled in sugar to make jams and preserves, or indeed they may simply be dried in the sun, like these sultanas and raisins. And fish may be smoked to kill off the dangerous microbes that lurk on its flesh.
These were all familiar food technologies to our ancestors. They had to be, after all, as the seasons came and went, the supplies of fruit and cereal, of meat and milk fluctuated. And so butter and cheese, ham and bottled fruit represented different techniques of preserving the nutritional value of the harvest. Looking back to those years at the beginning of the 1800s, Britain was still a rural nation of farms and villages. 80% of the population of only 6 million was still living in the countryside. But within only 50 years, that 6 million had trebled to 18 million, and the towns were teeming with people. 80% of the population was now living in industrial areas, attracted by work in the mills and factories like this. And along with the growth in the towns came new forms of transport. The railway, which ran to only 20 miles in 1825, had developed to a network of 12,000 miles by 1881. And so the close links that existed between the food producers and the food consumers in the rural communities began to disappear.
It was a time of immense social change. The population was migrating from the countryside into the towns and cities. The size of the population was multiplying almost explosively, and there were a series of disastrously bad harvests at home. On the other side of the channel, the Emperor Napoleon was conducting his campaigns. They had found that soldiers were more liable to die from bad food than they were to die from the effects of their wounds. And that gave the impetus for the development of a series of quite new means of food preservation.
Canister is a Greek word for a French invention, developed by the British and mechanized by the Americans. A glass canister like this was the first vessel used for preserving food. But a new era in food technology began when Napoleon appealed to French scientists for systematic ways of feeding armies on the move. A chef called Appert came up with a new bottling process which involved heating food inside airtight containers. And a few years later, an Englishman suggested using metal instead of glass. The British Royal Navy started using food preserved in tin canisters in 1814, mainly meat and soup. But for the general public, the first tinned foods were tomatoes, peas and sardines, which reached them in 1830. However, they didn't sell very well. For one thing, you needed a hammer and chisel to get into the tins, and for another thing, you needed to be very well off to buy them. A pint of soup in a tin cost 7.5p, at a time when the rent on a whole house was 12.5p a week. One of the reasons for the expense was that a skilled tinsmith could turn out only 10 cans a day, and getting the food in wasn't easy. It had to be chopped up into little pieces and pushed through a small hole in the top, which was then sealed with solder. By the time the American Civil War broke out, solutions to a lot of these technical problems had been found, with the open-top can with a double seal. And for the first time, the mass use of canned food was seen when the federal government commandeered all the stocks for the use of the troops in the war. Eventually, the soldiers took their new eating habits back with them into civilian life. The First World War had a similar effect on the British, but it was 1930 before canned food became a commonplace part of our national food supply, when the first high-speed can-making factory was built in Worcester. Since then, canning has remained one of the safest ways of preserving food. Indeed, the contents of a can from 1823, opened in 1958, were still perfectly preserved, 135 years later.
Mind you, at the time that food was sealed into its can, nobody would even have dreamt of the range of foodstuffs that were going to transform the nation's diet. The first 50 years of the 1800s have been known since as the hungry half-century. For most of the population, their diet was stodgy and monotonous.
It was essentially a carbohydrate diet of bread, beer, tea, some meat, some butter, and a little vegetable or fruit. In all, it probably amounted to no more than 2,000 calories. And if you'd been one of those attracted to the new factories in the towns, other dietary hazards lay in wait.
As more and more people became town dwellers, the length of the chain between producers and consumers widened and extended all the time, and that created more and more opportunities for fraud in the various links of the chain of manufacturers and retailers. Bread, for example, was widely adulterated with alum as a whitener. It allowed a cheap seconds grade of flour to be passed off as the more expensive firsts. That was, of course, mainly a fraud on the pocket and wasn't particularly dangerous to health, although there is some evidence that alum inhibited the digestibility of bread, and that could itself be quite serious. And on tea, for example, the customs duty doubled the price of tea from India or China. So there was an inducement to use the native hedgerows, which were used extensively, to mix with genuine tea. But it is astonishing that so much of our commercial practice in the mid-19th century was in fact based upon fraud. And some of these frauds were dangerous not just to the pocket but to the health.
fraudulent and dangerous practices like the adulteration of food and short measures inspired a small group of working men to set up this shop in Rochdale in 1844. They believed that a store owned by its customers was the best form of consumer protection. The 28 Rochdale pioneers, as they were called, clubbed together to raise £28, and after spending £16 doing out this old building, which had been a warehouse, they bought butter, sugar, flour, oatmeal and candles, and they recorded their purchases in this original account book. Previously, oatmeal had been often mixed with sand, and flour with plaster of Paris and chalk. But their food was wholesome, it was at a fair price, and the profits were to be shared. They did so well that within 3 months they were able to give a dividend of threepence for every pound's worth of food that had been bought. But it wasn't all plain sailing. Other shopkeepers became resentful, and they threatened the wholesalers that they'd withdraw their trade if they kept on supplying the new cooperators. The cooperators responded by setting up their own wholesale society in 1863. It was another major new step forward. For the first time, the wholesale side and the retail side of the food trade were part of the same organisation.
That's an example of the vertical integration of the business, bringing together the retailer, the wholesaler, the producer, and eventually even the farmer into a single organisation. There were clear economic benefits in that situation, and it did lead to greater consistency too, though there was the beginning of a limit imposed on strict consumer choice. But during the 1870s, the government's main concern was at least to cut down impurities in food. As one commentator satirically put it at the time, the public may now be cheated, but at least they won't be poisoned. The Food and Drugs Act of 1875, passed at that time, is still the basis of many of the laws that govern food today. And in fact, the last few decades of the 19th century were a crucial period for the involvement of technology in the preparation and production of foodstuffs.
Absolutely critical period in the development of food processing in this country and indeed in Western Europe generally. For example, in 1869 in France, they invented margarine. In the period immediately afterwards, there was the first arrival of a ship with frozen meat from Argentina. Joseph Rank took over his first flour mill. Henry Tate opened his sugar refinery at Liverpool, and in 1880, for example, steel rollers started to replace stones in the grinding of, in the milling of flour.
The changes in flour milling and therefore bread baking were to herald the industrialisation of food manufacturing that has resulted in today's concentrated, highly capital-intensive food industry. In 1860, there had been more than 10,000 wind, water and steam-driven stone grinding mills scattered throughout the major wheat-growing areas of Britain. They supplied thousands of small bakeries with a little of the expensive but fashionable white flour and a lot of the cheaper but unfashionable off-white flour. The British wheat they used was low-protein soft wheat, which produced small, dense, heavy loaves. But a couple of disastrous harvests in East Anglia, and of all things the success of the American railroads, were to change the whole picture in accelerating the advent of the newfangled roller mill and the demise of stone grinding.
The idea of putting grain through rollers instead of rotating millstones had been around since as long ago as 1820. But at that time, the engineering techniques weren't available to make good enough machines. Over the next 4 decades, all that changed. Firstly, of course, the engineering techniques themselves improved. Secondly, it turned out to be twice as efficient to pass grain through rollers than through rotating millstones in terms of converting power into flour. Thirdly, came the predictable, the reliable white product that people by then were finding increasingly fashionable. And fourthly, and perhaps most important of all, it was through rollers like this that the new hard grains that were then being imported into Britain from America in increasingly large amounts could be produced into white flour at all. The flour produced from these hard prairie wheats was like manna from heaven to the British bakers. Not only was it purer and whiter after milling in America, but it became whiter still by a process of natural bleaching on the long trip across the Atlantic. Upon reaching the baker, its high gluten content meant that it took up more water, made bigger loaves, and therefore meant bigger profits for both miller and baker in the newly formed price-fixing cartels. The new technology was impressively productive, and throughout the country, much of the traditional UK milling industry went into decline. Standardized baking trays, first used in this country in the manufacture of sweet biscuits, further enhanced the profitability of milling and baking, as the new, regular brick-shaped loaves became increasingly popular.
In the early 1930s, bread began to be wrapped in waxed paper in the interests of hygiene and in order that a brand name could be printed on it. And although this seemed a superfluous luxury at the time, the advent of sliced bread in the late 30s made that wrapping an obvious necessity. Today, wrapped, sliced white bread is almost more a way of life than of food, and thanks to the Chorley wood baking process developed after the war, your loaf will contain, in addition to the flour, yeast and water that you'd expect, an increased proportion of British soft wheat flour, soya flour, chemical aerators, gluten, fat, salt, improvers, milk protein and vitamins. It's become very big business indeed. 83% of the country's flour is now milled by just 3 major companies, and 70% of our bread is produced in bakeries owned in the main by just 2 milling and baking conglomerates. This enables the baking arm of a multifaceted food manufacturing company to pay a high price for flour to the milling arm of effectively that same company, thereby inflating the price, cutting out the competition, and making profits on the flour and the bread. It's a ruthlessly elegant commercial merry-go-round in which you and I appear to play very little part.
This is the standard sun-blessed medium-sliced white loaf. You can find something very like it in Sainsbury's, Keynote, Waitrose, the Co-op, Marks & Spencer and Tesco. Surprised? Don't be, for in spite of the different wrappers, the chances are they came off the same production line. It's a classic example of the economically concentrated nature of today's food industry.
217.20. Okay, Simon, is there any way to that?
It's an industry concerned as much with commodity dealing and millions of pounds worth of paper transactions as it is with the food that we all eat.
Steve, morning. It's Gilbert. Steve, morning. The market's just down a touch this morning, down 0.7 at 10 o'clock. But we're now looking for a profit of £1 million in the current year, perhaps £3 million next year. I just reminded you.
It's an industry which demands stockholder dividends and economies of scale, and it gets them.
Le Mercury Securities qui décide probablement de faire, disons, prendre une participation dans chaque fois
And if anybody's going to get kicked out of Hong Kong, it's certainly not going to be cable and wireless.
Okay, fine, thank you. Over and out.
At first glance, the different products going through this checkout seem to be evidence of diversity rather than concentration in food manufacturing. Some of the most famous British brands are here: Bird's Eye, Batchelors, John West. But Captain Birdseye and Mr. West and all the others are members of the Unilever family. The apparent choice is actually rather deceptive, because food manufacturing in Britain is dominated by a mere handful of massive empires like Unilever. When you look at some of the reasons for this concentration, it's clear that consumer demands have less influence on the British diet than the industries need to maintain profitability in the face of expensive technology and labour costs. There's basically no growth in the food market. After all, there's a limit to the amount of food that we can eat. So the industry has had to keep overheads down and profits up by looking for economies of scale, by getting bigger, making machinery produce faster, producing more varieties of the biscuit or whatever it might be, and by getting rid of workers. The variety of food is almost a byproduct of the battle for economic survival being waged by the food empires. While the consumer's criteria for choice might be taste and palatability, price and the nutritional value of food, for the manufacturers it's more likely to be shelf life, packaging, marketing and production costs.
But these days, the factors that go into the costing of food in shops have become incredibly complicated. How many of us now remember the days when, if ever you bought a packet of branded goods, the price was always printed on the label? That's because manufacturers used to decide the price at which their goods should be sold, whether it was from a big store or a small one. In 1964, the Heath administration abolished resale price maintenance in the interests of free enterprise, which seems fair enough. But there was one unforeseen backlash. It did mean that the bigger the organization, the greater its power to obtain generous discounts. That gave a surge of power to the development of the big supermarkets like this.
The growth of large multiple groups over the past 20 years or so has certainly had a very profound effect on the manufacturer's business and the way he conducts it, and is increasingly bringing pressure to bear on his profitability. And this is a disturbing factor from the point of view of the long-term advantages to the consumer, because while consumers can buy in the shops at cheaper prices, undoubtedly, because of the efficiency of the large multiple stores, supermarkets and hypermarkets, what you perhaps fail to recognize is that in the longer term, manufacturers' profitability needs to be maintained if they are to continue to invest in new product development, in basic research, in new processes and plant, in order to provide the consumer with the variety and choice which they've come to expect in the shops.
And it's a strange situation where a trade union is arguing for more profit for manufacturers. But unless the manufacturer is enabled to make a reasonable profit, then he will not be able to reinvest in tomorrow's generation of food manufacturing machines. And we will be trying to compete with our competitors on tomorrow's machines when we are in fact using yesterday's machines.
The key to those profits is known in the food manufacturing industry as added value. Quite simply, added value refers to the financial difference between how much a manufacturer has to spend in making the product and how much his customer, the retailer, is prepared to give him for it. The production costs will include the skilled labour force, the machinery, and the distribution network, as well as the raw ingredients, of course, such as the sugar, flour, salt, fat, and flavouring going into this sweet biscuit mix. This means that out of the 20 pence you'd spend on a packet of these biscuits, the raw ingredients account for just 7 pence. The packaging costs 2p, the labour and factory overhead 6p, and the added value, the profit to the manufacturer, is under a penny, while the profit to the retailer is nearly 4 pence.
Added value at one time was the difference between selling and what you sell in the marketplace and what you buy in the raw products, less the amount of capital that you have spent to produce that particular piece of food. Now added value is what you have been left with after you have given discounts to the large multiples.
And how is that distributed?
The added value is distributed into 3 areas. It goes to pay the ongoing wage costs of the industry. It goes to a return, a fair return, we would hope, to the shareholders in the food industry. And we would hope that, and this is the part that we are worried about the part that has been left over to regenerate the food industry. In other words, discounting is taking away the seed corn of the industry. There are many, many large retailers in this country who find themselves in everything at the present moment except debt. That's about the only thing they're not in.
We both need each other, and this is why I think the debate sometimes is a little sterile. We couldn't operate food shops without factories making the food for us. On the other hand, some of the manufacturers forget they actually need the shops to sell the goods as well, and it is a partnership. Now, the relationships with most of our manufacturers are very good, and there has been controversy in the last few years about the relationships between manufacturers and retailers, but I think it's much exaggerated.
Take something that you often read about in the press called delisting, for example. Now, delisting means that a store group has decided that it won't stock a particular manufacturer's brand, perhaps of one product, perhaps right across the range of his products. This happens as a means, really, of bringing pressure to bear on the manufacturer, usually to concede something extra in the way of discounts. The store group in question may claim that they're getting a smaller margin from the manufacturer than another store group. So in this jockeying for competitive position in the market, they will try to bring pressure on the manufacturer, and one of the ways they do it is by either actually delisting, that is, taking his goods out of the store, or threatening to do so. Usually after a matter of some weeks they'll come back again and they'll say, all right, we'll do a deal now. But sometimes it can be a matter of months before those brands are back on the supermarket shelves.
I don't like to look at it as delisting. I'd like to look at it the other way around positively and talk about listing and the products that we stock, because that's really what listing is all about, the products that you stock in a store. We are stocking a lot more brands than we ever used to. Now, we think that's important to offer people choice, but people want 2 kinds of choice. They want a choice between brands so that they can choose between Heinz baked beans and Cross and Blackwell, or whoever they may want to choose. In fact, they also want Sainsbury beans because they outsell Heinz in our shops. But people have a free choice. But we also think that people want to be offered other kinds of beans, and it's not just all about baked beans. And we think it's far better to have a choice of kidney beans and Carlotti beans, as well as 3 brands of baked beans, rather than to have 5 brands of baked beans. And it's very much related to what customers want. Now, in our view, they have moved beyond the concept of the brand quicker than the manufacturer has. The manufacturers have very considerable market power. What's happened in the last year or two is that whereas the manufacturers could dictate the terms in the past, the situation has become much more even now. The retailers have become stronger, I admit that, but I think the relationship between the manufacturer and the retailer is now much more equal than it was. They're complaining about the shift in balance, not the position.
These changes in retailing don't benefit everybody. Huge hypermarkets like the Sainsbury's do of course stock a wide range. There's everything here from junk food to whole food. The turnover's fast, which tends to keep prices down. But really, to take advantage of it all, you need a car and time, and that's no problem for the mobile middle classes. But on the high street, it's getting more difficult for people who are less well off to find cheap food within walking distance of home. The corner shop, for instance, has a slower turnover, so the rather narrow range of food tends to be dominated by packaged products, with a longer shelf life and higher prices.
Nutritionally, that may mean more processed foods, more additives, and invariably higher cost in precisely those markets that can least afford the expense, yet which most need the nutritional benefit. It seems somewhat bizarre that the high street grocer, the baker, fishmonger, butcher and fruiterer are now being squeezed out by the very market that a century ago they helped to create. What effect have these changes had on them?
Over the last 10 years, 48,000 independent grocers have gone out of business. They are still disappearing at an average rate of 1 per hour of each working day. And this is mainly due to indiscriminate discounting, or unfair discounting as we call it, which is being forced on the manufacturers by many of the large multiple retailers by the muscle they are able to exert on the particular manufacturers. It's just impossible to carry on as we are at the moment for very much longer, because the housewife will have no choice at all.
So the food industry appears today to be in somewhat of a pickle. Your shopping basket has become a battleground for the manufacturers, supermarket chains, and small shopkeepers, each trying to compete for a market that can't expand much further: our stomachs. And there's now so much at stake financially in this highly concentrated industry that stockholders' dividends and commercial imperatives overshadow the consumer's interests. Where then does nutrition fit in? Indeed, does it have any role to play at all in the food industry's thinking?
In 2 words, not much. I think that in this country, the evidence shows that if there is any nutritional problem in the population, it is only a small one, and it relates to obesity, not to malnutrition or undernutrition. So that manufacturers, I think, would in general take the view that the population is well fed and is well served by its food industry. But that isn't, of course, to say that they're not concerned about problems of nutrition, and they do pursue these very carefully.
The problem with nutrition is that it's not, in most cases, commercially attractive to people. People aren't buying products generally because they're more nutritious than another product. That in itself isn't something which makes people buy things, generally speaking. But we think that we've got a responsibility as retailers to provide people with food that is better for them than other food, and to give them a choice. Now, in order for them to make that choice, you've got to give them the information. And you've also got to persuade them to try something which they may not otherwise have tried. People may not be very conscious that they're interested in something nutritional, but you've only got to look, for example, at the growth of brown bread over the years, and in our case we're now selling as much brown bread as white, to see that there's been a tremendous change in public opinion. So whilst people might not say they were very interested in buying that because it was more nutritious for them, they are in fact doing it because they like it. Public opinion has changed.
And it's continuing to change. Bakeries now sell more brown bread than white, prepared from wholemeal flour and using techniques that became unfashionable 100 years ago. Fashions change, but the need for healthy eating doesn't. While the food industry remains as commercially concentrated as it is, there can be little hope that food will continue to be anything other than refined, processed and, like plastic toys or car body parts, manufactured.
Well, the effects of eating a diet rich in processed, refined foods is to take in more energy than you need, more calories, to take in more salt than you need, but to take in less fibre and less of pretty well all the vitamins and the minerals which we know to be necessary for our health. And so, even if we cannot give an exact threshold as to what is safe and what is dangerous, the trend is always going to be towards a dangerous situation.
How dangerous, though?
Well, this is controversial as to exactly how you blame specific diseases on specific eating habits, but the opinion is growing stronger and stronger now that diseases as important as cancer of the large bowel, diabetes, gallstones, and even coronary heart disease have in common the eating of this kind of diet as a main contributing factor.
Does that mean that people are eating only those foods, processed foods, or that they're eating too many of them in a mixed diet?
Again, it's a question of what the threshold is, and nobody can say for an individual person how much it's safe to eat of, should we say, ice cream or cake or something. All we can say is that the more you eat of these refined processed foods, the greater you're going to increase your risk of these various diseases. And there is no need to eat them.
But that's easier said than done. So much of the range of food available has been processed, and often it contains additives. In many cases, the same sort of additive no matter which brand you choose. In the past, the trade keeps saying that the public aren't interested in nutrition, and what's more, nor are we. But the people in the street that we keep talking to as this series go by say that they are interested in nutrition, and they do want to know much more about what goes into their food.
And that's what we'll be looking at next week, at how you can find out exactly what you're eating, and at how important the standards we set for food are, and the labels that we stick on it. Join us again next week.